Hi, and welcome to Macro Matters. My name is Stephanie Kelly, and together with my co-host Paul Diggle, we'll be guiding you through the complex world of politics, economics, and markets. This week, it's politics that's back on the agenda, particularly with the US at the forefront of investors' minds. And this is particularly because last week, we saw the highly anticipated inauguration of President Joe Biden pass without major incident and to great fanfare.
History, faith, and reason show the way of unity. We can see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors. We can treat each other with dignity and respect. We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. No progress, only exhausting outrage. No nation, only a state of chaos. This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge. And unity is the path forward.
When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
There, you heard a snippet of President Biden's inauguration speech, and I couldn't resist including a section as well from the young poet laureate Amanda Green's words heard around the world. But we're not here to talk poetry. Rather, we're going to talk about the new administration, what it might have in store for investors, and crucially, how partisan politics is likely to play a role in the policy decisions that get made and ultimately the macro environment that we find ourselves in. So to do that, I'm joined by Clayton Allen. He's a director at Eurasia Group, having previously worked in the Senate, for the White House, and in investment markets. So he really brings a wealth of knowledge around not only Democratic Party politics, but also the overall policy environment. And I think that's going to really help us get to grips with this new political environment. James McCann, our Senior Global Economist, is back again. He's going to be joining later on to talk about what all of this means for our growth forecasts and for markets. But first up, Clayton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I'm super excited to get started. So I'm just going to dive in with maybe a little bit of a general question, which is just how would you describe the state of the Democratic Party kind of political divide today? How unified is the party versus, say, under the Obama administration?
Sure. So that's an interesting question, and it's one that has actually probably a couple of different answers. Overall, the Democratic Party is relatively aligned. They are certainly more aligned than the Republican Party is right now in the U.S. That said, the Democratic Party, even in alignment, has never been really a monolith. There's always been many different divides, many different sort of factions within the party, and certainly it's worth noting what those are because some of them, especially moderate Democrats in the Senate particularly, are going to have a really big impact on the direction of policy moving forward.
So what are those kind of key groupings then of Democrats?
Sure. So the ones to watch are in the Senate. You have obviously some very progressive members that have just recently been elected. You also have kind of a traditionalist faction, which is most of the leadership, senators that have been in office for several years, multiple terms. And then you also have a group of Senate moderates. And Senate moderates are a much smaller group than they used to be back in the early 2000s and even, just after 2010 when I was in the Senate or worked in the Senate. There were maybe 6 to 8 Democrats who would identify as very moderate, willing to cross the aisle and sponsor bipartisan legislation, willing to take a more conservative view on a number of different individual policy areas. Today, there's far fewer of them. There's probably really only 4 true moderates, 4 senators who are truly willing to break with the party. But there's a group of about 7 that skew a little bit closer to the center of the political divide and are worth paying attention to. They're not as officially organized as they used to be. There used to be something called the Blue Dogs Caucus, actually, which was, kind of odd name aside, was a self-identified group of moderates in the Senate who strove to align with each other on policy more than they may be aligned with their progressive party leadership. On the House side, it's a much more diffuse group. You have House leadership, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and their compatriots, who are very traditional. They, kind of tend to follow the members of their caucus ideologically. You have an increasing number of progressive Democrats. Probably the most progressive group of them are what are called the Justice Democrats. This is a group of relatively recently elected members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, Ayanna Pressley and a few others, who really skewed very much to the left end of the spectrum. On the other end, you have three groups to pay attention to. The New Dems, which are a large group of members who won in races in 2016 and 2018 in states that either had supported Trump or in districts that had previously been Republican. That's probably the most expansive group, but they're not exactly as all consistently moderate as the next two. You also have the MOD Dems, MOD Dems. This is kind of the mirror of the Senate group. This is members who maybe self-identify as moderate. It's a smaller group than the New Dems, and some of them have been in office for quite a while. And then finally, you have the Blue Dogs, a caucus that sort of went away in the Senate, but is still in existence on the House side. And these are the most conservative, the most moderate Democrats. But they're an increasingly small group of people, so don't really carry the ideological heft that they used to. If you want to kind of boil it down to sort of specific names to watch, on the Senate side, it's really a story of Joe Manchin and everybody else. Joe Manchin is the most moderate senator, and he is also the senator who's probably going to use his status as a moderate outlier to direct policy to the most aggressive degree of any of the people that we would consider.
So maybe Joe Manchin's a good place to start then in terms of those key individuals. And in particular, I guess, what kind of drives Joe Manchin's political decision making? There's a lot made about his focus on fiscal deficits, for example, but at the same time, he seems to be kind of, in some ways, quite a bread and butter labor union kind of Democrat. I mean, what do you think is going to drive the policy choices he makes? What kind of motivates him? What are his incentives?
That is probably the $64,000 question in Washington right now. Everyone is trying to figure out what exactly does Joe Manchin want? And more importantly, how can you get Joe Manchin to want what you also want?
Right.
You mentioned a couple of things there. I've heard people mention that Joe Manchin is a deficit hawk. I've heard people mention that he is a social moderate or a social conservative. I've heard people mention that he's a fiscal conservative or is, anti, extreme environmental regulation. And each of those is maybe true to a limited degree. But I think it's important not to try to boil Manchin's ideology down to one specific issue set. Let's take deficit, for instance, or fiscal conservatism. Manchin is someone who certainly is going to advocate for moderation in how much the federal government spends, but that's not really out of a concern over the deficit. It's more because Manchin's personal political appeal is different to every other Democrat in Congress, and it really hinges on him being perceived in his home state as someone who's willing to break with, or should be seen separate from, what is an increasingly progressive or increasingly liberal-leaning Democratic leadership. That translates into pushing back against major spending programs, but he's not pushing back against those programs out of the same desire to reduce the deficit that someone like, say, Ron Johnson might, a Republican from Wisconsin. He's doing it because he needs to go back to West Virginia and be able to tell people, hey, I convinced Chuck Schumer to spend a lot less money. I'm still fighting for your interests. Really briefly, it's important to understand kind of why Manchin needs to make that differentiated appeal. He comes from one of, if not the most conservative states in the U.S. West Virginia voted for Trump in both 2016 and 2020. In 2016, Trump had a 42-point margin of victory. In 2020, Trump had a 39-point margin of victory. That means that he had 39 percentage points more of the vote than Joe Biden. Manchin, a Democrat, won re-election in between those two presidential races in 2018. Manchin won with a 3.3% margin. If you kind of boil that down, it means that there are a lot of people who probably voted for both Trump and Joe Manchin. That's a really interesting and kind of hard to comprehend and dynamic. But it means that Manchin, when he's going back to the state and trying to tell people that he's representing them and they need to vote for him again, He's trying to appeal to people who skew much more conservative than the average Democratic base, and who maybe are okay with Manchin being a Democrat, but they're certainly not okay with Democrats like Chuck Schumer. They need to see him as a different and independent
Right.
person.
I think that's a super interesting, I think, sense of context as well around, the realities in West Virginia and the Trump support that still exists there. I guess my natural next question is, it sounds like in terms of headline figures, Biden announced $1.9 trillion COVID support bill. It sounds like your expectation is that will be kind of Biden or Manchin will be looking to bring that down a bit to be able to show evidence. I guess my question is naturally, how strong is that pull? And then on the other side, are there sweeteners or are there specific issues where Manchin is likely to be, I guess, able to go along with larger bills because there are elements that are relevant to West Virginia, or that, he can still kind of prove that he has been successful in some way to his voter base?
Absolutely. And maybe taking those in reverse order, because I think the answer to your first question is maybe a little bit more complex than I might have made it seem. Taking the second one in hand, are there things that Manchin would ask for in exchange for spending that progressives like that kind of bring him on board? The answer is absolutely. I will try to be as diplomatic as I can, but Joe Manchin is very much a transactional politician. If you can benefit West Virginia, then he's willing to hear you out. And there are a lot of things that West Virginia needs. When we're talking about stimulus, payments to households are something that Manchin has said he's skeptical of, but not because he necessarily opposes paying people directly. It's that he wants those payments to be targeted at lower income brackets. That has two major impacts. One, reduces the overall cost of the bill. Two, it keeps that money flowing to people who disproportionately make up a lot of his base. It's something that does benefit his state. When you talk about other priorities, state and local funding, which is something that Democrats have broadly supported, is drastically important for West Virginia. West Virginia generally does have budget issues, revenue shortfalls. Certainly, COVID has exacerbated that. So making sure that grant programs which benefit the specific needs of West Virginia are included or are very substantially benefited by any state and local aid provision in the stimulus bill is a really good way to bring Manchin on board. Now, the answer to your first question, which was, is Joe Manchin going to push back against this $1.9 trillion proposal and bring the cost down? And I think the answer is yes, but he's not doing it alone. So over the weekend, you had a really fascinating look at what's probably going to be a dynamic that plays out a lot over the next 2 years, which is Joe Manchin sort of convening or saying he convened. Whether or not he actually did is maybe a question for another day. But certainly he's taking the credit for convening a group of moderate Democrats and Republicans to work with the White House to try and negotiate a policy. And they did this over a phone call. It was talking about the stimulus. And the feedback the White House got from Manchin and others was, look, 1.9 trillion is too much. It's more than we're willing to spend, but we could see that coming down. Senator Angus King, who was on the call, he's nominally an independent, but he caucuses and votes with the Democrats. He was on the call, and he's maybe someone who's also interesting to note, because King is one of the moderates that I would identify as being more wanting, but he's maybe a little bit more difficult to pin down than Manchin. However, on the call, he said 1.9 trillion is more money than I think should be spent right now. We need to keep in mind that we just passed 900 billion in stimulus and really focus this next bill on the things that are actually needed. So Manchin has some backup in pushing against the White House and saying we need to bring the cost of this down. But he doesn't have a blank check. This is the beginning of a Congress, and Manchin, even though he wants to be independent, and King, even though he wants to be independent, still need to work within the Democratic Party. They both need the support of their party members to really do anything. That means that Manchin and King cannot be the vote which blocks stimulus moving forward. So they're going to push to bring the cost down, but they're only going to push so far. They don't want to be the people that stop this major Democratic priority moving forward. They also don't want to be the vote that stops people receiving direct stimulus payments or stops some of these programs which are very popular from moving forward. So when you think about this 1.9 trillion, we think that comes down. I think our house view right now is that it's going to fall somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 1.8-ish trillion dollars.
Right. So you're still kind of penciling in a decent amount of stimulus there. I mean,
Oh,
I think,
absolutely.
does that assume that this is all done by reconciliation? Essentially, so for listeners, the options that Democrats have on the table is they can work with Republicans in the Senate in particular to try and pass a bill that both parties can support, or at least members of both parties can support, or they can go through what's called reconciliation, where they only need a very simple majority, which they would have. But of course, you can't lose any senators in that process. Are you assuming that it's this reconciliation process, this Democrats go it alone kind of approach that they take?
First of all, you did a great job of explaining what is a very wonkish and kind of overly complex topic, which is how the Senate works. I would add two sort of clarifications that really help to understand why moderates are so important, why we're talking about them so much. When the U.S. Senate does business normally, you need 60 votes to clear a procedural threshold. And when you only have 50 Democrats, you can do the math. That means you need 10 Republicans. And getting 1 or 2 Republicans to vote for something, that's not a huge challenge. You can probably do that in most cases. Getting 10 of them to do that, that's a pretty high barrier, especially when you're spending over $1 trillion. However, if the legislation that you're trying to pass is only related to spending money, so direct spending out of the government, or generating revenue through new taxes, or decreasing revenue through tax breaks, you can use a budget reconciliation process, which is a way for, as you noted, the Congress to move legislation without the need to hit that 60 vote threshold. You only need a simple majority of the chamber. And right now, Democrats have 50. They also have the vice president, who serves a sort of a traditionally ceremonial role atop the Senate, but does have a tie-breaking vote in the case of a 50-50 split in the chamber. So effectively, Democrats have 51 votes. You noted, though, that means you need all 50 Democrats to vote for something. If Manchin or King or Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona decides, hey, I don't like this, and you only have 49 Democrats, well, even with the vice president's vote, you can't pass anything. So Manchin, King, and all the other moderates effectively have a veto vote over this reconciliation process. That doesn't mean that Democrats won't move forward. The reconciliation process is still much more straightforward. It's almost certainly where they're going to go. President Biden has made some comments that he wants, stimulus to be bipartisan. He would love to have 10 Republicans come and join the bill. And that's something that they're probably going to at least make a public show of negotiating towards over the next 2 weeks. But at the end of the day, everyone who's been following this, and really congressional leadership on both sides, have pretty much admitted reconciliation is where we're going to end up. We're going to end up moving this on a 51 vote threshold. It's probably going to be a partisan vote. And it's going to include just those things which can be included in the reconciliation process. So again, only things that spend money or cut or raise taxes. You can't include things like changes to the minimum wage, for instance, that people like Bernie Sanders really support.
That's a super useful kind of summary, I think, of where the challenges are. I guess you mentioned Bernie Sanders there, and my next question was going to be essentially, we're super focused on moderates. I think it's useful you've mentioned not only Manchin, but also King and Sinema. I mean, where do progressives come into this debate? Do they essentially just have to take whatever they can get from the moderates? Is that how you expect it to play out?
No, because we've been focused on the Senate, but anything that moves forward has to pass through both the Senate and the House. And
right.
It's kind of easy to get too focused on one or the other. Certainly during the last Congress, I think we all focused too much on the House because that was where a lot of legislation was moving. But Pelosi and her members, they get a say in this. And
right.
the House Democratic caucus is more liberal, effectively, than the Senate caucus. So what can pass the House is probably a more left-leaning bill than what can pass the Senate. But the Senate needs to keep that in mind, and certainly Manchin and King understand that and know that at the end of the day, they're limited in what their party compatriots in the other chamber are willing to accept. So progressives absolutely do have a say. I think it's important to recognize that they maybe have more of a say in the House, and moderates have more of a say in the Senate.
I think that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, the kind of whether any kind of, I guess, back and forth develops between the House and the Senate. And I mean, obviously, this conversation is super focused on the Democratic Party, given that that's the new majority in Congress, given that we have a Democratic president. But where do you expect Republicans to fit in? And you mentioned maybe one or two Republicans might support, some of the bills that get passed through. I mean, are there particular Republicans that you'd be watching for? And generally speaking, how do you expect the Republican Party to play this next 2 years before the next round of midterm elections?
So the Republicans are going to be fascinating to watch. I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this that, the Democratic Party is more internally aligned. They're more cohesive than the Republicans are. And that's true simply because of the impact of President Trump. You have already this kind of very obvious split between the 10 members of the House who voted in favor of impeachment and every other Republican in the House. We're about to see that divide potentially emerge in the Senate as well, where you have some senators, including possibly Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who would be open to the idea of voting to convict President Trump. And you also have a lot of Republican senators, led by Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton, who are arguing very hard against impeachment. So you already have this kind of fundamental split within the party. And when you have that sort of division, it becomes much harder for McConnell to kind of manage his members and keep everybody uniformly moving in one direction. He is probably the best at doing that in DC. He is, certainly regarded as a political master in terms of managing his own members, but it's going to be a pretty difficult task for him. And there's a few Republicans who are maybe worth watching, as you mentioned, when it comes to stimulus. Susan Collins from Maine, ironically, the counterpart to Angus King, is probably the easiest one for Democrats to look at and say, we could get her on board with the stimulus package. She was on the bipartisan call this weekend with the president, with the White House, rather. She's actually speaking to Brian Deese, the head of the National Economic Council. But she's probably the one who Democrats look at and say, okay, it's conceivable that she could come on board with stimulus. Some of the other ones to watch, Lisa Murkowski always crops up when you talk about Susan Collins, and for good reason. They've emerged as probably a caucus of two, Senate moderate women who vote together and support each other when they have to take these kind of risky positions, as we saw them do several times during the last Congress. You can add to that list Senator Mitt Romney from Utah. He's no one's definition of a truly moderate member, but compared to a lot of the very far-right members that make up the Republican caucus today, he looks a little bit more moderate in comparison. Don't think he's really gettable for a stimulus deal. He's been pretty open with his objections to massive stimulus. He is someone who cares about the deficit. But when you start to think about other policies later in the year that might also include stimulus effects, things like clean energy spending and the like, Romney might be pretty interesting to watch.
So I think that's a super useful, list of names for us to keep in mind. And I think we've gotten a really strong sense of the dynamics, not only in the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party. So I think that's been super, super useful. So thank you so much, Clayton, for that. In the next segment, we're going to go on to talk about what this kind of political environment means for our forecasts and the market outlook here at ASI. So I think the first part of the show really gives us a strong sense of the political environment that's going to be facing not only President Biden, but also actually senators in Congress and House Representatives. I think that gives us a strong sense of moving forward. How do we take this political view? And I have to say, internally, our political views are quite similar to Clayton's, who's obviously representing the Eurasia Group view. We kind of think on balance, ultimately, that they will move forward with fiscal support. We've been a little bit more cautious in terms of penciling in what we describe as a floor for COVID support of about $1 trillion. But we do think that if they go down the reconciliation path, that does drift higher. And then we've penciled in some additional fiscal stimulus later in the year. And I'm going to bring James on now to talk about just what we've got penciled in terms of fiscal support and what that means for the growth forecast, but also then we'll move on to what it means for the market environment. So James, thank you so much for joining again.
No, not at all. Thank you for having me.
So as I mentioned there, we've penciled in some kind of cautious fiscal figures. So maybe first, you want to lay out what we've got in mind in terms of the fiscal policy environment?
Absolutely. And as you sort of slightly got to there, we've been relatively cautious in the near term. So when we were thinking about the Georgia runoffs and what that might mean in terms of policy, particularly as Clayton has outlined really nicely in a very closely aligned, very narrowly contested Senate, we've put in around $1 trillion into our formal forecasts for further short-term COVID support. Now, the expectation is that takes a form of different measures. It includes things like topped-up stimulus checks. It includes some state and local government funding. It includes funding for vaccine rollouts as well. But obviously, that has our expectations around that, I think, have drifted a little bit higher since, particularly with Biden putting his first negotiating point with a price tag of 1.9 trillion for short-term COVID support. So I think he's absolutely right, and we're cognizant of, particularly around the process, whether this is bipartisan or whether this is through reconciliation. I think that'll be an important signpost, particularly around some of those, key groups within the Senate, but also the House. I think there's certainly a risk that $1 trillion does drift a little higher, but for our formal forecast, we've got 1 trillion baked in. And then we've obviously had to think, our forecast goes for a number of years, we've had to think, what else does Biden get done from a policy perspective? Obviously, he didn't set out just short-term COVID relief measures in his manifesto when he was looking to get elected. He has a whole range of different priorities. They include things like green energy infrastructure investments, a host of different spending measures, be it around care, be it around education, building on the Affordable Care Act in the healthcare space. They obviously have a large tax plan as well, which would provide some tax cuts, but predominantly higher taxes, principally for higher earners and for the corporate sector too. So we think that sort of suite of policies nets out to a further net stimulus. We think that stands between $500 billion and $1 trillion. Obviously, significant confidence intervals around that, but it'll be interesting to see, how much additional stimulus comes through that measure. So really very, very large sticker prices on these. And when we look at them compared to GDP, you're talking additional fiscal impulses in the short term of at least 4.5%, if not higher, and then a further 3.5% if that mid-range for additional fiscal support. These are all of GDP. So our growth forecast has become, very noticeably much stronger over the course of 2021 and even feeding into 2022. We now see this sort of mix of very, very supportive underlying monetary policy conditions and very, very loose and extended fiscal policy as being quite a potent combination. We think the recovery will be well over 5% this year in terms of GDP growth, getting close to 5% next year. And what that does is it really reverses a lot of that historic short-term damage that we saw during the initial COVID recession, all those headlines that this was the deepest in a generation. Certainly we think that the economy will, if that growth is delivered and if those fiscal packages are able to be passed, there's the potential to get us back onto that pre-COVID path some way through the course of next year. And that's really an astonishing achievement, given if we remember back to the financial crisis, and we never recouped all the lost ground from the financial crisis. The global economy settled onto a lower permanent growth path. So I think this mix of monetary and fiscal and the very extended fiscal policy support really does pose quite a different growth and inflation environment for the US.
So I think that's a super useful way to think about it. I guess in particular, just given that we see the numbers we penciled in broadly as a floor for this kind of support suggests that there's probably even further upside. I guess it might be worth then just saying, you mentioned that monetary policy, the combination of fiscal and monetary policy will be very supportive for this growth environment. It might be worth just spelling out, now that there is this kind of Democrat clean sweep in place, how different is your outlook for the Fed and crucially inflation versus kind of prior to this, if we had ended up with, say, a split Congress?
Exactly. And I think for thinking about monetary policy, I think the inflation angle is just critical. So let's go back to that recovery. If we think that recovery is much more robust, then you're using up all that spare capacity in the economy. We're expecting a much lower unemployment rate on a 2 to 3 year horizon. The natural question then becomes, as all that spare capacity and slack goes away, are we going to see a much quicker rebound in inflation? And we've certainly, to be consistent with that stronger recovery, we have been revising up our expectations on US inflation. But we need to be a little bit careful, I think, not to get too carried away. The lesson of the 2010 experience, the recovery from the financial crisis, was that the US economy in particular can run pretty hot before it generates inflation. We know we managed to get unemployment rates down well below what we'd sort of consider to be normal into, let's say, the mid 3% sort of levels. And that didn't really kick off very aggressive inflation. And certainly the translation of price pressures from that decline in slack was pretty slow. So I think we want to be a little bit careful about expecting too quick or too aggressive a rise in inflation. And I think the Fed is sort of taking a very similar approach. Obviously its new average inflation framework means that it will not raise interest rates or tighten policy preemptively. It really needs to see that evidence in inflation rise towards target and get to target before it changes policy. So when we think about the Fed, I think it's going to be slow going, reflecting the fact that we think it'll take them a while to hit that target. We've penciled in a tapering in their asset purchases over the course of next year, 2022, and then we don't think conditions will be in place for them to start tightening policy through interest rate hikes until late 2023. Certainly, if recent comments from Powell and Clarida are followed through on, that the Fed wants to see inflation get to target, stay there for a long period of time before it tightens. So it's certainly the case our expectations for inflation and policy increases, tightening monetary policy, they've been brought forward by a unified Congress, by a Democrat clean sweep. But it's certainly not the case that we expect the economy to snap back to normal and a very sudden adjustment in monetary policy to be on the way.
I think that's an important kind of point to bear in mind, just given that there's a ton of coverage about, hyperinflation and ideas like that. And I guess, as you say, it's just the evidence from recent past would suggest that even at certain levels, that it's just hard to see how inflation that really is meaningful and sustained is generated. So maybe given that now we've got a good sense, very supportive fiscal policy, supportive monetary policy that, we don't expect to go too quickly. We don't expect inflation to just take off and create kind of issues there. What does that mean for investors in terms of the winners and losers, maybe at like the sector level? What does it mean for investors that we have this Democratic Congress?
Yeah, I think you've done a great job there. It's almost a Goldilocks style environment, not too hot and not necessarily too cold, or at least not so hot that the Fed is forced to sort of take the punch bowl away very, very rapidly. So I think it's right. We can be, I think, fairly confident about the overall macro environment, but maybe the most interesting stuff is happening at the sector level, particularly when we look at, a whole range of Biden's policy priorities, be it around, as I mentioned, green energy, be it around tax hikes for certain parts of the US business and household sector, be it around different regulations. So, when we speak to our fund managers, I think that's where the really interesting discussion now is ending up. Sort of who is the winners, who are the winners and who are the losers from all of this. I mean, perhaps the energy sector provides a neat way of illustrating that. Certainly, both through the regulatory standpoint, but also through, I guess, a refocusing of priorities and activities. We might make an argument that the traditional energy sources, so fossil fuel extraction, etc., they might be areas in which we're less confident, whereas those sectors within the energy sector which are more focused on green energy could be an area for greater priorities. If we think that infrastructure plan will have real size and scale, we might expand that and think that broader materials and utilities might be relative winners among all that. So I think we come out with a relatively nuanced point. We can be relatively, I think, confident about the macro outlook under this combination of policies. But I think really there's going to be a lot of give and take at the micro level, at the sector level. And for investors, we've really got to understand, where that legislation hits, where it creates winners through additional government spending, but equally where it creates some parts of the economy which might struggle a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a useful sense of the relative opportunities and indeed risks, which, investors have to just take into account both of those, particularly in the environment that we're in. So that's all the time that we've had. So thank you so much, James, and to Clayton for joining us today. I'm sure these are topics we're going to continue to talk about in the months ahead, as US politics, I expect, will continue to be front of mind for investors as they try to navigate the fiscal and growth environment. As always, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe on whatever you listen to your podcast on. You can also be part of this conversation now. We've got an email inbox if you'd like to communicate with us. Nothing personal or sensitive, of course, but if you'd like to send an email with any questions, comments, suggested topics for this podcast, please email macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com. In the meantime, we hope you'll join us again next week.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.